Okay, hello everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. Happy Valentine's Day to everyone. I'm really excited that so many people are going to spend their Valentine's Day learning about birds. This is pretty exciting. And I think we will get going because as always, as every single week, we have an awful lot to cover today. So for those of you who haven't heard me introduce myself before, I'm Catherine Dale and I'm coordinator of the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And we're joined here today also by Jenna McDermott. Jenna, are you there? Can you turn on your camera and mic and say hi? There she is.
Hi, everybody. Glad you're all here with us.
So Jenna is the assistant coordinator of the Breeding Bird Atlas, and since I'm giving tonight's presentation, she is going to be monitoring the chat and hopefully handling any technological issues that come up. Good luck with that, Jenna. So Jenna and I both work for Birds Canada, and so I apologize to those of you who have heard this spiel before. We sort of do the same thing every week for anybody new who's joining us. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Birds Canada, it's basically considered Canada's voice for birds. So it's the leading science-based bird conservation organization in the country. And our mission is to advance the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of Canada's wild birds and their habitats. How do we do this? Well, we have offices across the country. We engage in a lot of science. We establish strong partnerships with other organizations and industry. And we run a whole wide range of programs. And one of the cool things about our programs is they're almost all citizen science based. So that is, they rely on people just like you conducting the surveys and submitting their observations. And we couldn't do this work without you. So each year, roughly 30,000 volunteer citizen scientists. And I made a note to myself, this slide, as you can probably tell from the picture, is quite old. So we're guessing it's more than 30,000 now. They go out across the country to collect data for a variety of Birds Canada programs. So we're kind of newcomers here in Newfoundland. We only established an office here in 2019, and currently we run two programs in Newfoundland. And the first is the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And as I said before, if you want to know more about the Atlas in detail, come on out to our webinar on April the 4th, where I'll talk about the Atlas and how it works and what our goal is. But in a nutshell, it is a 5-year citizen science program to map the distribution and the abundance of all of the bird species that breed on the island of Newfoundland. So we take observations submitted by citizen scientists and create maps like the one you can see on the right there, where each colored square represents where a species, and in this case, it's the spotted sandpiper, which you can see in the middle, places where the spotted sandpiper has been found breeding. And I'd like to really emphasize that anyone can contribute to the Atlas, and we appreciate observations from everybody. So for example, after this webinar, you will hopefully recognize spotted sandpipers. And as you can see from that map there, where the white squares indicate places that haven't been surveyed, there's lots and lots of room for additional breeding evidence of spotted sandpipers in Newfoundland. So hopefully some of you will go out and find some evidence of a spotted sandpiper breeding and help us to build our map. The other program we run here is the Nocturnal Owl Survey, and we're actually just starting to get into gear for that this year. So the survey takes place between the 1st of April and the 15th of May each year, and in a nutshell, it involves citizen scientists who take on a route, and they go out along this route of 10 stops, and they listen for owls along this route just one night every spring. So we're also looking for volunteers who are interested in the Nocturnal Owl Survey. I'm hoping we'll actually be doing a separate webinar on the Owl Survey to get people interested and see what it entails. But if you're interested or would like to know more about either of these programs, you can send us an email. Okay, and just finally, before we get started, again, we need to acknowledge all of our partners and funders. An Atlas is a crazy amount of work. It requires help from many corners, and without our industry, NGO partners, government partners, we wouldn't be able to do the Atlas, and we wouldn't be able to offer programs like this webinar series. All right, on to the business of the night. And I hope none of you mind our R-rated photo here. As some of you can probably tell, we are catching these yellow legs in a moment that seems appropriate for Valentine's Day. They are in fact mating. So today we're going to talk about wading birds, and by that I mean herons, rails, and shorebirds. And then we're going to talk about game birds. And you'll notice I've stuck geese under game birds. They don't really fit there for reasons that I'll get back to, but we needed to put them somewhere, so that's where they ended up. Same caveat as in previous weeks, there's just so much to cover that we've narrowed it down to species that actually breed in Newfoundland according to the checklist, Newfoundland bird checklist that Nature NL offers. And we're really focusing mainly on the plumage that they have during the breeding season. And today, to make things just a little bit more interactive, we're trying something new. So I have put in a quiz at the end. We'll be running polls and seeing if people can identify some of the species that we're looking tonight. So there will be a test on this, but don't worry, it's anonymous. So we're just curious to see how it works out. And again, apologies in advance if the technology doesn't cooperate. All right, so launching right into it, we're going to talk about our herons. We have two species to talk about, and the first is the American bittern. So it's a medium-sized heron. It's relatively common, but it's a solitary shy bird, and they really like marshy areas. They nest on the ground amongst the dense vegetation, and they're really, really good at camouflage. So particularly when they're in this pose here, where they've got their head pointed at the sky and their neck straight up, they can vanish amongst the vegetation like you would not believe. So things that you're looking for if you're lucky enough to see a bittern, and sometimes they are visible, you can see the white throat. You can see a black patch that extends down the neck. They've got a really thick, solid neck, particularly compared to some other herons, which are a little bit more graceful. And then they've got these bold stripes, which is what helps them blend in with the vegetation. Now, we also tried something else new tonight. Apparently, I was trying all the technological things. So a lot of birds, particularly wading birds, are actually more often heard than they are seen. As I said, bitterns are very, very good at hiding, but they make a super distinctive sound. It's actually a deep gulping, it's called a pumper lunk sound. And to make this noise, they gulp air into the esophagus and then use the stored air to make the call. And it's super low frequency, which carries really well through the dense marsh vegetation, which tends to absorb higher frequency sounds. So I have set my computer to share sound, and we are going to see if this works. Jenna, can you just tell me whether you can in fact hear the American bittern sound?
Yep, we're good.
Excellent. So clearly that's a pretty distinctive sound, and when you hear that, you know that there is a bittern around, even if you can't see it. The second heron that we have in here is one that's super familiar to me coming from Ontario, but they're actually, so they're pretty much, it's a widespread heron. It's found across North America, and it's usually common within its range. But actually, that is not true here in Newfoundland. So these herons actually are rare throughout most of Newfoundland, with the exception of the southwest corner of the province, where we have a small breeding population in the Codroy Valley and up the west coast a little bit. When I say small, according to one of our very well-known birders, Bruce McTavish, we were talking around 20 pairs in 2018. So it is a pretty small population. But those of you who are from other places will likely be familiar with the great blue heron. It's our largest, heaviest heron. It's got a nice, long, snaky neck. And as you can see, that's considerably thinner than the neck on the American bittern. So that's what I meant by the bittern having a thicker neck. It's got that dagger-like orange and yellow bill, which it uses to spear or to grab fish. It's got a grayish blue body, hence the name, great blue heron. It's got dark plumes on its head, and then it's got shaggy plumes on the back and on the neck when it's breeding. They eat fish, obviously. They usually stand upright in shallow waters to forage, and they nest in colonies. Actually, in trees, often with other wading birds. So, it's funny because you would think that a huge bird sitting in a giant stick nest in a tree would actually be very noticeable, but they're pretty good, in fact, at keeping their nesting colonies secret because these colonies can be located several kilometers away from water. And in fact, it actually took quite a while before great blue herons were listed as a breeding species here in Newfoundland, because while people were reporting seeing them, nobody could actually figure out where it was that they were nesting. I also wanted to show a photo of a heron in flight. There aren't all that many species that you could mistake a great blue heron in flight for in Newfoundland, but a couple of things to look for just in case. So you'll see that those black flight feathers contrast pretty sharply with the grayish blue body, so you can look for those. They also have this little rust-colored patch here that could be harder to see in flight. And they often fly with their neck tucked in like that, but not always. Sometimes they do fly with their neck extended. Okay, so those are our two breeding heron species, but just before I go on, I wanted to highlight kind of a fun finding. Newfoundland tends to get a lot of sort of rare vagrant birds that aren't actually supposed to be here. And this is a tricolored heron that showed up in Cape Friels last May. It was photographed by Kayleen Stagg of the Indian Bay Ecosystem Corporation, and I think Kayleen's actually here tonight. And when she posted this photo, birders went nuts because it's a very unusual species to have here. You can see this is the range map, and it breeds along the Caribbean and along the Atlantic coast in the US, but not in Canada. So it definitely was not supposed to be here. Unfortunately, it didn't stick around for long, so most of the birders who went out to Cape Friels to see it were disappointed. But definitely keep your eyes open when you're birding in Newfoundland, because we can get some pretty strange visitors. All right, so moving on from herons to our rails. And once again, we're just looking at two species here, really. So the first is the sora. Sora are small. They're about the size of a quail. Again, like the bittern, they're pretty hard to see, but they're easy to hear when they're around. And they're the most abundant and widespread rail in North America. In Newfoundland, they are a rare breeder, but they're regularly found in some of our marshes. So for example, Lundrigan's Marsh, if you live in St. John's, there are soras heard there every year. However, nobody's actually proven that they're breeding here because they are very hard to see. So if you're lucky enough to catch a glimpse of the sora, and it does happen, you've got this gray face with a black mask. You've got white below tail, and I think it's kind of good to point that out because according to Cornell's All About Birds site, soras walk like a chicken that has had too much coffee, nervously flicking their tails and exposing the white feathers below. So because they do this tail flicking behavior, you will actually notice the white below their tail. And then they have that stout yellow bill, which people refer to as candy corn shaped and sort of almost colored. So that yellow bill is pretty distinctive. The most commonly heard call for soras is a loud descending whinny. And the first time I heard it, I thought that it sounded like somebody in the middle of an awkward situation at a party, laughing kind of hysterically to diffuse the situation. So I remember that really well. Every time I hear a sora, I think of somebody at a party. And males and females both whinny to defend the territory and keep in touch with each other. So I'll play the whinny for you. So yeah, we're not going to get too much into birding by ear in this particular webinar. The one right at the end of the series on April 11th is about that, but the calls that I'll play tonight should be pretty distinctive. So if you hear that whinny coming from a marsh, you know that you've got a sora. Oops, we don't need to hear them twice. Once was good. All right, the second rail that you may see here in Newfoundland is the Virginia rail. Again, it's a small secretive marsh bird. It's probably more likely to be heard than seen. It's specially adapted to pushing through the dense vegetation. So as you can see, it's a pretty short bird. It's got to push through all that dense marsh vegetation. So it's got long toes, flexible vertebrae, and its forehead feathers are actually specially adapted to reduce the wear and tear because it's pushing with its head through the vegetation. Very rare in Newfoundland. I'm not sure there are any confirmed breeding records, although Megan and Jenna, feel free to jump in if I'm wrong about that. These guys like freshwater marshes with lots of emergent vegetation. And one of the interesting things about this species is that it builds dummy nests. So in addition to the nest where it actually lays its eggs, it builds a bunch of other nests where it doesn't lay eggs. So I guess you'd have to actually see the eggs in the nest to be sure that you had a breeding Virginia rail, but it's not a huge concern because it would be quite difficult to find a Virginia rail nest. So for these guys, we've got a reddish bill, a cinnamon colored neck, and a gray cheek. And then here on the flank, you can see this black and white barring. And the sound that it makes is kind of a pig-like grunting call, which trails off at the end. And again, this is performed in duets by males and females to defend the territories and communicate with each other. So you hear this grunting, sort of repetitive trailing off grunting coming from a marsh, you know that you're probably looking for a Virginia rail. Oh, and again, to remember to use my mouse. Okay, so we've gone through herons and rails already, and that's because there really aren't many of those that breed here in Newfoundland. Shorebirds, however, is going to take us a little bit longer. So when I say shorebirds, what do I mean? So we have several families. They come in many shapes and sizes, but they tend to share some physical and behavioral traits. So they like open shoreline habitat. They're usually carnivorous. They eat insects, mollusks, crustaceans, etc., although sometimes they eat plant matter as well. And they tend to have round heads and long legs, and then they wade in shallow water. They do tend to lay their nests on the ground, so just in a scrape on the ground. And obviously that doesn't provide much protection for the eggs. So the best protection that shorebird eggs can get is just not being detected. And that involves camouflage. So shorebird eggs tend to be extremely difficult to see, and birds tend to choose to nest on substrate that actually matches the color of their eggs. The adults themselves are often cryptically colored, and then the nest lacks any visible structure that would attract the attention of predators. In addition, because many predators hunt by smell, the preen oil, so the oil that the birds produce to preen their feathers, in many shorebirds, it actually changes to a different chemical compound during the breeding season, which has no scent because they don't want to be leaving anything to attract predators to the nest. And just as a note, this is also why you need to be careful if you happen to find a shorebird nest, because you don't want to leave scent cues that can lead predators to the nest. When you're looking to ID shorebirds, I will freely admit shorebirds are tricky to ID. Even having just stuck to the ones that actually breed here in Newfoundland, there's a lot to cover. So what you want to look at is sort of the shape and the structure. So the bill, the legs, the overall body proportions, and then the habitat choice and feeding behaviors. That can tell you a lot about what species you're looking at. As I said, there are several families of shorebirds, but today we're going to focus on these two main families that have representatives in Newfoundland. So the plovers, family Charadriidae, and the sandpipers, family Scolopacidae. Okay, so plovers tend to be small to medium-sized shorebirds, and actually this silhouette down here is plovers, whereas this is a sandpiper silhouette. They have short, sharp bills that are tapered at the end. They have a short neck and tail, or in this case, kind of no neck. And they use their eyes to locate prey. And because of that, they tend to have sort of a stop and start run form of foraging. So they'll run ahead, stop, look around, see what they can see, then run again. And the heads of many species are strongly marked, and that's important to remember. In contrast, when you're talking about sandpipers, it goes from very small sandpipers, and we're talking about the smallest today, to very large shorebirds. They have long, thin bills that are rounded at the tip. And they actually have nerves at the tip of the bill to feel for food while probing the ground. So they don't actually have to be able to see it. They use their bills to find food. So we'll start with the plovers. Killdeer, again, this may be one that many of you are familiar with, and it's certainly the first shorebird I became familiar with. It's common and widespread, although again, like many of the things we've talked about tonight, it's a rare breeder in Newfoundland. And if you look at the standard maps of the killdeer range, it doesn't actually even include Newfoundland. Killdeer like open ground. They don't necessarily need to be by water. So despite what I just said about common characteristics of all shorebirds, killdeer are a little bit different. You can find them inland. You often find them on lawns, golf courses, athletic fields, that kind of thing, any open space. They're a tall, slender shorebird with an unusually long tail. So a lot of the plovers in particular have quite short tails, but killdeer have long tails. They have a brownish back and wings. They have a double breast band, which is diagnostic. No other plovers have that, but they're downy young. So the very young birds actually have a single breast band. So be aware of that because when you could confuse that with some of the other plovers. They have a white breast and belly, and they do have this orange coloration, which you can just barely see on the rump here. It's a little bit more visible in flight. And when I first heard someone talk about a killdeer, my mental image was of something quite different to this. I was picturing an enormous bird of prey that could take down a large mammal. Turns out this is not where killdeer got their name. They were named after the call that they make pretty much incessantly. And in the 18th century, naturalists also referred to them as the chattering plover and the noisy plover. So males will make this call constantly while they conduct display flights. So if you hear this and you can't find the bird, just look up, basically. So this is the killdeer call. And something else I wanted to talk about with killdeer in particular is distraction displays. So when I was talking about shorebird nests, I said that shorebirds don't so much build a nest as they just sort of plop their eggs on the ground. And camouflage is a great defense for these eggs. But another tactic employed by many species are these distraction displays to actually draw predators away. So the adults will often fake having a broken wing so that predators will follow them for the promise of an easy meal. And they will quite happily display to people as well. So this is a killdeer on a golf course in BC that was quite sure that I must be there to eat his eggs. So it's doing a pretty dramatic display for me. And I think it's worth mentioning, we talked a lot about at our Ducks and Loons webinar about what was breeding evidence for species. So how do we know that something is breeding? And even though in this picture, you don't see any eggs, you don't see any young, all you see is the killdeer doing the distraction display, that would still be considered confirmed evidence of breeding because there's no other reason for this bird to be behaving that way except to draw me away from its eggs. Or if it did in fact have a broken wing, but since it happily flew away at the end of this, I think it probably didn't. Okay, our second plover species. This is the Semi-Palmated Plupper. They look a tiny bit like miniature killdeer, so they're quite a bit smaller, but they only have one breast band. I also chose this photo specifically to show you that shorebird chicks are essentially the cutest things in the entire world. You cannot beat a shorebird chick. They're like pom-poms on very long legs. The Semi-Palmated Plupper is a rare breeding bird in Newfoundland again. It mostly breeds in the Arctic, but its range does include Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. This is another name that confused me at first when I first heard it, is Semi-Palmated Plover. And I once taught a class of university students, and one of them insisted on referring to it as a semi-plummeting plover, which also gives a great mental image. It's actually called semi-palmated because it has webbing between their toes for only part of the length of the toe. So it's a partly divided toe, but a partly webbed toe. And there is actually also a semi-palmated sandpiper, which we're not going to talk about today. So the semi-palmated plover, you've got this stubby orange and black bill here. You've got a black crown and eye patch, and Megan Boucher, who is here again tonight and one of our expert birders, said that you can think of it as the adult having a black driving goggles and a scarf, which I think is kind of an excellent image. You'll note that it has a headband here and it has a noseband. It also has yellow legs. You can't see them in this picture, but importantly, it has a single breast band, unlike the killdeer's double. And I wanted to highlight this because semi-palmated plovers are another species where we clearly have lots and lots of room left for breeding evidence for the atlas. So now that you know what they look like, if you happen to come across one, I think we can probably improve on the 6 atlas squares where we currently have evidence of breeding. Okay, and then we have the piping plover. So you may look at this and think, okay, looks an awful lot like the semi-palmated plover. You'll find the piping plovers along shorelines. There are actually populations in the Atlantic and the Great Lakes and in the Great Plains. They do tend to forage alone or in small groups, which is a little bit different from other shorebirds. And they tend to stay a bit farther away from the water's edge. They actually nest in soft sand that's back from the water. Things to look for, they have a dark headband. They have a sandy gray back. They have a narrow breastband. In some cases, it can be incomplete, and they have orange legs. So for those of you who are thinking, okay, what's the difference between these two? I do have this comparison slide because I agree it can actually be quite challenging to figure out. So you'll notice that the semi-palmated plover has a head and nose band, whereas the piping plover has just the headband. It doesn't have that nose band. It's also generally lighter in color. So if you think of the difference between wet sand and dry sand, that's a good comparison to make. You'll see the dark complete breastband versus a narrow, sometimes incomplete breastband on the piping plover. And some of you may have noticed, some of the astute observers may have noticed that in all of the pictures I've shown of piping plovers, they're wearing these leg bands. Sadly, that is not a natural way to tell the difference between them. I wish it was, but this is actually because piping plover populations, particularly in the Atlantic, are intensely monitored. The species is actually listed as endangered in Canada after dramatic population declines. And unfortunately for them, this is largely due to the fact that piping plovers really like to nest on sandy beaches, and this happens to be a habitat that humans also enjoy very much. They like to build houses there, they like to spend time there recreationally, they like to drive ATVs there, walk their dogs there, etc. And equally, unfortunately, piping plovers are extremely sensitive to disturbance. So they really, really don't like being disturbed. And if there's enough disturbance, they'll actually abandon their nests. And then, as I say, habitat loss. So there just isn't as much sandy beach to nest on due to either development or beach management activities and natural predators. So you can just see on the edge of the photo here, there's a gull who would be quite happy to eat the piping plover's chicks for lunch. So these are major issues for the piping plover. And I just want to highlight that Birds Canada actually has piping plover conservation programs in a number of provinces, such as Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And what they do, they work with partners to protect the nests with fencing and predator exclosures to make sure that the chicks actually do hatch. And then they have volunteers that help monitor the nests and engage with beach users to increase awareness of the birds and discourage disturbance around their nest. And then as part of this program, piping plover chicks do get banded. In Newfoundland, we don't have a piping plover program, but our populations here are monitored by the Canadian Wildlife Service, Parks Canada, and a variety of NGOs like Intervale. All right, so we're moving out of plovers and on to sandpipers. I should check the time. I think this could go on for quite a while. All right, so 8 o'clock, we're doing all right. So all of the shorebirds that I've mentioned so far have been rare breeders in Newfoundland. It seems to be the theme tonight, but this guy is different. The spotted sandpiper is actually much more common. And happily, he's also really distinctive in appearance, sounds, and activity. So spotted sandpipers are a great way to get into shorebird ID because they're easy to recognize. It's the most widespread shorebird in North America, and it's certainly one that you are likely to come across during your birding adventures in Newfoundland because they're found almost anywhere near water, and that includes inland along streams and rivers and lakes and that sort of thing. They really like rocky shores. And they're also neat because they display what we call sex role reversal. So in this species, females establish territories and defend them, and males provide parental care. So they incubate the eggs and then they shepherd the young when they hatch. So a spotted sandpiper in breeding plumage is relatively easy to identify. You see the spots on its belly and breast that give it its name. It's got a nice dark eye line and an orangish bill. You can't see it here because it's not in flight, but it has a white wing stripe and then these olive brown legs. And they are quite distinctive vocally. So a rapid series of wheat calls, basically. And I'll see if I can play that. And it's often the first way that you'll notice one. They sort of bob along the shoreline and you'll hear that call. And they've also got this very unique bobbing behavior as they walk, or it's also called teetering. So they constantly bob their tail up and down. And they have a very distinct flight too, a fluttering flight. But I wanted to actually, seeing as we're getting fancy tonight, I wanted to show you a movie of the bobbing motion that you see in a spotted sandpiper, because it is extremely distinctive. So let's see if we can. Right. So this is in BC, but the movement is equally characteristic. And it's not letting me advance to 24 seconds, which is where we're really going to see this behavior start happening. There you go. So that is that unique bobbing behavior that's very easy to notice and very distinctive. Okay, and all right, so that's the spotted sandpiper. And if you come away with nothing else tonight, I suspect that you will remember the spotted sandpiper and be able to recognize him. Another sandpiper we have here is the least sandpiper. And as the name suggests, it's a very tiny sandpiper, the smallest of the shorebirds. And in fact, it's not much bigger than a sparrow. So it weighs less than an ounce. Like the semi-palmated plupper, this is mainly an Arctic breeding shorebird, but it is a rare breeder in Newfoundland. So we do find them breeding here. So its size is a really good cue, but other things you can look for are this hunched posture while it's foraging. So it's got its neck tucked in there. It has a dark bill, which is slightly decurved, by which I mean it curves just slightly down. You really have to look for it, but it is there. It's got this barring on the throat and chest, at least during the breeding season. Yellow-green legs. Oops, and I am realizing that, something has, there we go. Right, it's got yellow-green legs, and these yellow-green legs are in fact extremely distinctive. So it's a good way to tell that you're looking at a least sandpiper and not, for example, the semi-palmated sandpiper. However, because least sandpipers really like to forage in mud, their legs can be difficult to see because they can actually be stained with dried mud and look just brown. So if you can see the yellow-green legs, it's a really good cue. Let's see, what else have we got here? So we've got white or buff edging around the feathers and a rusty speckling on back, which you actually don't see in this particular picture. And in fact, it's more obvious on the juveniles than the adults. Okay, so another sandpiper, and one of my absolute favorites here in Newfoundland. Again, I really like the easy to recognize ones. And this is a greater yellowlegs, and the name tells you exactly what you're looking for. It's known in Newfoundland as a Twilik. That's the Newfoundland name for it. And it is a bird of the boreal forest. You can tell that you can identify yellowlegs partly because they tend to wade deeper in water than many other shorebirds. And these guys are interesting because even though they're common and widespread across North America, they really like to nest in bug-infested bogs. And believe me, after the past summer, I'm very aware of this. So consequently, they're actually one of our least studied shorebirds because researchers don't really want to go into the bug-infested bogs to find out what's going on with them. Ways to recognize a yellowlegs. Well, it's a large shorebird. It's quite slender, and it's most easily distinguished by its long, bright yellow legs. It's also got a long, sturdy bill. And when I say long, it's more than 1.5 times the length of its head. It's also got barring on its flanks here, which is not easy to see, but that can actually sometimes extend around the belly. And some breeding birds may actually have heavily streaked underparts. And then it's got a small head and a slender neck. And the call of the great yellowlegs is actually a clear, ringing choo 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 kind of. It's usually given in sequences of 3, which sounds almost like the bird is saying its name, yellowlegs. So I will play that call for you. So when you hear that, look around for a yellowlegs. Oh, thank you. And yellowlegs are actually also known for their alarm calls. And in fact, some of the colloquial names for it are based on these alarm calls. So they also can be referred to as telltales, tattlers, and yelpers. So this picture I took of a greater yellowlegs in a tree, and I thought it was pretty much the silliest thing I'd ever seen. It does not look like it belongs in a tree. But they like to perch up high like that and just alarm call at you constantly while you're in their bog. This guy, I think, went on for about half an hour. And so it's this very loud, monotonous call, which can get very annoying when it goes on for half an hour, but it's also, again, really good evidence of breeding. So even if you don't see the nestlings, that sort of agitation is a strong indicator that you may have a bird that's breeding. All right. Now, of course, I said that greater yellowlegs are easy to recognize, and now I'm going to add in a wrinkle, because there's also a species known as a lesser yellowlegs. And in fact, generally, when you're looking at bird names, if something is called greater, you can usually guess that there's a lesser one, and it's going to be hard to tell apart from the greater one. So lesser yellowlegs don't breed in Newfoundland, and they're much less common. So we usually see them migrating through mostly in the late summer, early fall. And of course, like anything named greater and lesser, the easiest way to tell a difference between them is size. So the lesser yellowlegs are about 1/3 smaller than the greater yellowlegs, and they just look generally more delicate. But of course, size is a relative thing. And so it's really only useful when you have a situation like this, where you have the 2 birds really close together. If you don't, which is often the case, it can be hard to tell the difference between them. So a couple things to look for when you've got a lesser yellowlegs, you've got a shorter, thinner bill. And remember, when you have a size situation and you don't have the greater yellowlegs there to compare it with, compare it to the size of its head. So this bill is not more than 1.5 times the size of its head. And then you've got fewer markings on the flank, so you won't have yellowlegs that have those heavily barred underparts. Of course, it's only breeding yellowlegs that have, or greater yellowlegs that have heavily barred underparts, and we only see lesser yellowlegs when the greater yellowlegs aren't breeding, so that's not always a helpful cue. Voice is also a really good cue. So the most common call for these guys is a single or double noted call versus the 3-syllabled call that you hear in greater yellowlegs. So listen to the number of syllables, and that's also a useful way to tell the difference between the species. But they certainly are tricky, and I often find myself questioning myself. And actually for tonight's presentation, I ran all of my photos past Megan Boucher just to make sure that I had identified my yellowlegs correctly. Okay, just a few more sandpipers to go through. Now we have the willet. And it's funny, I found that I had much less to say about the willet than anything else. And I feel that this often happens to the willet because it's kind of non-distinct. So it's a large shorebird with a relatively large head. It's a similar size to the greater yellowlegs, but stockier. So the greater yellowlegs is fairly delicate looking. This is a stocky shorebird. And again, this is a rare breeder in Newfoundland. It nests close to the water's edge. And as I said, it's pretty indistinctly marked. So it's mottled gray overall. It has a large, thick bill. So that's actually thicker than some of the similar species. It's got these dull colored legs. But the nice thing about willets is if you can see them in flight, they've got this really distinctive black and white stripe on their wings. So a willet in flight is not so indistinctly marked anymore, and you can be pretty sure of what you're looking at. Okay, just a couple more species in the shorebirds. This guy is a Wilson snipe. So these guys, they're plump birds. They're, again, among the most widespread shorebirds in North America, and they are common breeders in Newfoundland, like the spotted sandpiper. However, they're another one of these birds that you're actually more likely to hear than you are to see. So they've got pretty cryptic coloration, but that being said, when they're not flying, they do actually like to perch on exposed fence posts and that sort of thing. So you can actually notice them when they're perched up on these high areas. They also nest near water. They like shallow wetlands and damp, muddy habitats. And they look really stocky. Like this is a pretty stocky bird. Looks a bit like a football player with no neck. And they look partly stocky because they've got extra large breast muscles, so pectoral muscle. And this muscle, in fact, makes up almost a quarter of the bird's weight, which is the highest percent of all shorebirds. And because of this, they're actually really fast flyers. They don't look like they'd be particularly good athletes, but they can reach speeds estimated at about 60 miles an hour. Another interesting Wilson snipe fact. So the word sniper originated in the 1770s amongst British soldiers in India who hunted them as game. So they're actually quite hard to hit, hence the word sniper. And they fly in a fast and erratic way, which makes them even harder to hit. So cues for the Wilson snipe. As we have already said, they've got a large head and a thick neck, so kind of a football player, chunky stance. And you can note how far back on the head these eyes are set. So shorebirds do have eyes on either side of their head, most birds do, and therefore all birds have a wider field of vision than we do, most birds, sorry, not all. But the Wilson snipe can actually see, because its eyes are so far back on its head, it can actually see almost as well behind it as it can in front, which makes it really hard for a potential predator to sneak up on the snipe because it actually almost literally has eyes in the back of its head. It also makes it hard for you to sneak up on a snipe. So they've got this nice striped crown. They have a very long bill. The bill is pretty distinctive. Even in flight, you can see this very long bill. They've got a white belly, short tail, and short legs. And then again, we see these barred flanks. And you can't see it in this photo, but they do have 3 buffy stripes down their backs. And I said that they are much more often heard than seen. And this is partly because they're most active at dawn and dusk. And then again, as I said, they're quite cryptic. But again, you've got this super, super recognizable sound with snipe. So the male performs a flight display in which he circles high overhead, and then he dives at high speed. And the air passing over his tail feathers makes what we call a winnowing noise. It's very, very distinct, and I'll play it for you. So, oops, I think we've jumped ahead. We'll go back to the snipe. That winnowing noise, the only thing that's even vaguely similar to the sound of a snipe winnowing is boreal owl song, which hopefully Jenna will introduce us to next week. But I can tell you from personal experience that if you are out pretty much anywhere in Newfoundland in the spring and summer, you will hear snipe winnowing at night. So it's really distinctive, very easy identification cue. All right, and our last shorebird here, the American woodcock. So in some ways, a little bit similar to the snipe, you've got another plump shorebird with a very long bill, short, stocky, short neck, big head, eyes very far back in the head. But unlike other shorebirds, woodcocks actually live in young forests and scrubby old fields, and their plumage gives them really good camouflage in these places. So again, a rare breeder in Newfoundland, with what is thought to be a pretty restricted range in the southwest part of the island. But again, like the snipe, these guys are most active at dusk. So it's possible they're more common than we realize, and they're just going unnoticed. So ID cues for the woodcock. You've got, again, that long straight bill. There's a gray collar around the neck. Can't see it in this photo, but we've got gray stripes down the back. Unlike the buffy stripes on the snipe. And then you've got these bright cinnamon underparts. And You do have stripes on the crown, again, like the snipe, but they're striped in the opposite direction. So whereas the stripes on the snipe run from front to back, these run between the eyes, which is quite unique. And like many of the birds we've talked about today, they also have a really distinctive sound. So they make this nasal peent noise. And they do this when they're giving these amazing aerial displays, sky dancing, basically. So the male will sit on the ground and give these buzzy peent calls, which I'll play for you. So once he's given a few of those calls, he will fly upwards in a wide spiral. And then at about 200 to 350 feet, he'll start to descend and zigzag silently down. And then he starts painting and does the whole thing all over again. So if you hear those peent noises, look up at the sky and see, well, look on the ground first, but then the bird will go up in the sky as it does its flight display. And we are very interested to know whether American woodcock are more common in Newfoundland than we've been thinking. Okay, so I'm going to stop with the shorebirds there. But I wanted to mention that, as I said, we've really just focused on the shorebirds that breed in Newfoundland. And there are actually many, many more species that you might expect to see in Newfoundland, particularly during fall migration, where it's an important stopover ground. So we do see some shorebirds in the spring, but not nearly as many, because in the spring, birds that nest in the Arctic are usually in a really big hurry to get to the Arctic. So they basically fly straight up the middle of the continent and they don't detour out to Newfoundland. However, in the fall, they tend to be a little bit more leisurely. And in the fall, all of the good food is also ready here. So it takes some time for the invertebrates that these guys feed on to develop. We need some warm weather here in Newfoundland before there's really a lot of good food for shorebirds. So in the fall, along the mudflats and the coastlines of Newfoundland, you'll be able to see big flocks of mixed flocks of shorebirds. You can really see some extraordinary, unusual species, and they'll be fueling up for their southward journey. And Cape Friels in particular on the northeast coast is a hotspot for shorebirds. It's a really great place to go to see migrating shorebirds, even on days when there's no tricolored heron there. And if you're really excited about shorebirds after this talk, it's also worth mentioning that the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society runs a Newfoundland and Labrador shorebird survey. So you can check that out if you're interested. All right, so moving on from shorebirds, we're now going to get into game birds. And here we're really talking about one family. I know I mentioned geese. Technically, if you consider game birds to be any birds that are hunted for food, then geese and ducks would be included, but traditionally we don't consider them game birds, not in this particular grouping. So what we're talking about here are chicken-like ground-dwelling birds that eat primarily seeds and buds, but also do eat insects. And one of the characteristics that sort of joins the family is a takeoff, which is very explosive, and they've got this rapid beats of stiff rounded wings, and they can surprise you a lot when they take off when you're near. So the first game bird I want to talk about is the ruffed grouse. So it was introduced into several areas in Newfoundland in the 1960s and 70s to provide game for hunters. These are forest understory birds. They like to eat leaves, buds, and fruits of deciduous trees, and they're very wary of humans. They'll often wait until people are quite close before doing that explosive takeoff that I mentioned, which, as I said, can be quite a surprise. And the name, the ruffed grouse, refers to these feather tufts on either side of the grouse's neck, which you can see in this photo. And both males and females have them, although males have larger ruffs and females' ruffs are less conspicuous. So these guys are ground nesters, and they're year-round residents here in Newfoundland and Labrador, so you can see them in the winter. Things to look for when you're looking at a ruffed grouse. Big thing is this black tail band. So that is diagnostic. That's a very useful characteristic. They have the ruff when they're displaying. They're not always displaying. They also have a crested head, which you actually can't see in this photo, but I couldn't pass this photo up because Jenna and I took it this summer while we were out doing bird surveys and came back to the car to find an angry ruffed grouse pretty much right there. And then they have dark flank bars, which again are a little bit hard to see in this photo. And I swear this is the last time I'm going to say this tonight, but this is another bird that tends to be more often heard than seen, because as I said, they are actually very wary about humans. And so we don't see them quite as much. Males, however, make this characteristic drumming sound using their wings, which you can actually hear over long distances. So they'll stand on a raised surface like a stump or a branch, and they'll beat their wings back and forth. And you'd think that the thumping comes from their wings actually hitting the body. But in fact, it actually comes from the fact that they're pumping their wings back and forth so hard that they're creating miniature sonic booms. And I always think it sounds a little bit like a helicopter starting up or a faraway motor. So here is our ruffed grouse drumming. So I will say that is actually the very first bird sound that I learned to recognize in Ontario. And I still get a great deal of pleasure every time I hear it, because I think I know what that is. And if you're in the middle of nowhere and you hear what sounds like a helicopter standing up or starting up, it can actually be pretty confusing. Something else to mention about ruffed grouse is that they can actually, you can see a lot of color variation in the plumage. So you can have grayish brown individuals like this, or reddish brown individuals, or sort of intermediate kind of just brown individuals. All right. So moving on to our second grouse species. Again, an introduced species. These guys were introduced in 1964 for hunters. They're much smaller, though, than the ruffed grouse, and they're considerably less wary of humans, and can actually seem tame when they're approached, because they just sort of hold still and rely on their camouflage to hide them, which earns them their Newfoundland name of fool hen, which seems a little harsh, but nonetheless. They feed primarily on pine and spruce needles, but they also do like blueberries. And so cues for a male spruce grouse, which is what we're looking at here. You've got a gray neck and head. You can't see them here, but there are white spots on the lower belly. You've got that black throat and chest and a red eyebrow. So this is a male actually taking a dust bath. This species is quite sexually dimorphic. So with the ruffed grouse, I didn't show a picture of the female because it is actually quite similar to the male with a smaller ruff. However, when you're talking about spruce grouse, you see that there's quite a difference. So these females that come in two color morphs, gray and chestnut, and they do look a little bit like ruffed grouse females, but they're much smaller, and they've got a much shorter tail than the ruffed grouse and barred underparts. So that's your female spruce grouse. And then just because I had to, I threw in this photo of a spruce grouse chick. I'm hoping it will serve as encouragement for you guys to go out and look for birds, because spruce grouse chicks are amazing. And in fact, when we were out doing atlas surveys this summer, we came across spruce grouse families in just about every location that we did surveys. So they're quite common. Okay, so finally, we come to our two ptarmigan species here in Newfoundland, the willow and the rock ptarmigan. And unlike the grouse species, the ptarmigan species are native rather than introduced. So willow ptarmigan, they're the largest of North America's 3 ptarmigan species and relatively common. So they're tundra dwellers that move into sheltered valleys for the winter. And in Newfoundland, we find them on the maritime barrens near the tips of our major peninsulas, and also in open upland areas. And so again, we have a sexually dimorphic species. This picture is of a breeding male willow ptarmigan. They've got that really nice chestnut neck. They've got a short stout bill and a red eyebrow, then a white belly, short tail, and feathered feet. I love ptarmigan feet. And they are apparently the only grouse in the world where the male regularly helps raise the young. So when ptarmigan pairs get together, they stay together for about 7 months. So from the beginning of the breeding season up until the chicks are independent. I said they're sexually dimorphic. So here we have, if you can find the bird in the picture, a female willow ptarmigan. So you can see, here she is, here are her eyes. Here's the ptarmigan. She is actually incubating eggs in this picture. They're sort of a mottled black, brown, and white. And obviously, that works particularly effectively as camouflage in the tundra. And actually, I took that photo years ago when I was working in Alaska. The thing about willow ptarmigan females is they will stay put until you have your foot up in the air over them. And then they kind of, with that characteristic explosive takeoff, come out, explode out from under your foot, and often you fall over backwards and shriek, or at least that's usually what I did. And if they're brooding young ptarmigan, they will run everywhere like ptarmigan popcorn. It's a very interesting experience, but probably not good for your heart rate. And I said that we're mostly focusing on breeding plumage, but our ptarmigan are year-round species. So I'm also going to mention the winter plumage. So both male and female willow ptarmigan turn white in winter and they blend in with their snowy surroundings. So basically this guy's just entirely white. And the best part is their fuzzy white feet. So these feathered feet function as snowshoes to walk over the snow. And ptarmigan will also excavate snow burrows in which they can take shelter from the elements. And finally, we have the rock ptarmigan, mostly an Arctic grouse. Newfoundland is actually the southern extent of its range in North America. It is similar in appearance to the more common willow ptarmigan, but it's smaller. And rock ptarmigan spend their lives on tundra-like terrain, so they don't go into the valleys in the winter, but they do move closer to the coast. So in Newfoundland, you will find rock ptarmigan in cool Arctic-like areas like the tablelands of Grouse Moor. So they have a red eyebrow, they have a short bill, a white belly, and a mottled brown back. They are also sexually dimorphic. So here is our female rock ptarmigan, again with chicks. Again, one of the cutest things ever, basically. So females are mottled brown and black they have this little red eyebrow. And in the winter, ptarmigan also turn white. However, they do have black outer tail feathers, and it's important to note they have this black stripe running from the bill to the eye. And males will also have that distinctive eyebrow still, but they do have that black stripe. So that is a really good identifying cue for rock ptarmigan in the winter. And I just wanted to mention that male rock ptarmigan actually stay white during the courtship period. So females lose their winter plumage much faster for camouflage. But males will keep this white plumage during the courtship, and then they will intentionally dirty their feathers afterwards, because being white on the tundra is asking for it from a predator. So they'll dirty their feathers until they've molted into their brown summer plumage. And just to focus on comparing the willow and the rock ptarmigan, you can see these are the males in breeding plumage. These are the males in wintering plumage. So the willow ptarmigan has this chestnut cinnamon neck and head. The male rock ptarmigan does not. And then if you look at the winter birds, you'll see the big difference is this black eye line on the rock ptarmigan. Females of the two species I did not include here, they're actually extremely difficult to tell apart. So female willow ptarmigans have a stouter bill than rock ptarmigans, and they're actually a warmer brown, but both of those things are relative, and again, quite hard to tell unless you have the two birds in front of you. So one of your best cues for the females is going to be habitat. So rock ptarmigan, like the barren rocky areas of tundra, and willow ptarmigan, like areas with more vegetation. Okay, and we are going to finish, this is the last species of the night, with the Canada goose, which I think is a fitting picture for Valentine's Day and also the upcoming Family Day in many provinces. I feel a little bit silly even pointing this out because many of us are extremely, extremely familiar with Canada geese. And if you grew up where I did in Waterloo, you regularly hear stories of them chasing the University of Waterloo students all around the campus. But just to pull out the identifiers here, they are much less common in Newfoundland. The big thing is this white chin strap. So you've got a black head, you've got a long black neck, and then you have the white chin strap. The body is an even brown, the tail is black, the undertail is white. And that is the only goose species breeding here in Newfoundland. So that is, that's really all I needed to say about them. I think everybody recognizes the Canada goose. Okay, we do not have much time left. I've got a minute, but I do want to see if we can just give these polls a try. So as I said, they will not identify you, but if you want to vote in this poll, what is this bird here? And we'll give it just a few minutes while people vote. So all of the species that I'm asking about are from the presentation tonight. Okay. I'm seeing things slow down a little bit. We'll give it another minute. Well, not a full minute since we're already over time. All right, things seem to have slowed. We will end the poll. So 52% of you got it right. I think you should be able to see the results now. Those are piping plovers. Some of you guessed killdeer, but you just see the single breast band here, so not a killdeer. Some of you guessed semi-palmated plovers. That is quite an easy mistake to make. But look at this lighter back and also just the headband, not the nose band. Okay. And so that's piping plover. Next, we've got this guy. And where's my polls again? Okay. So what do we have here? Oh, more people are voting in this one. Great participation, guys. That's awesome. We've got more than 75% of people participating. Excellent. Okay, things seem to have slowed down. So I'll end and I'll share the results. Almost everybody got Wilson snipe on this one. Good job. A few people had American woodcock, which is understandable. Again, that's a very similar shape, a similar long bill. But notice that the stripes run from the bill to the back of the head and not horizontally the other way between the eyes. And then you see these buffy stripes down the back. So those are good clues that it is a Wilson snipe. Okay. And this guy. I'm glad to see nobody got American bittern on that one. All right, so what is our third mystery bird here? All right, we seem to be, oh, we're getting even more people participating. Excellent, people know this one. Good job. Okay. All right, so what we've got here. Again, most people got it right. 85% of you said Virginia rail. A few of you said Sora. Again, understandable mistake to make because they're similar shaped birds. Sora, though, you're looking for that bright yellow candy corn bill. That's your biggest cue that it's a Sora. I'm hoping that the person who said willow ptarmigan is kidding, because that would be quite different. And purple sandpiper, that was in fact my mistake. For a while, I was going to talk about some of our migrating species tonight. But no, it would have a very characteristic sandpiper shape if it was a sandpiper, much longer legs. Okay, and so here's our Virginia rail. All right, so here's a slightly trickier one. We've got our shorebird here. All right, we seem to have sort of stalled. Oh, no, a few more people participating. All right, I'll stop it there. Okay, so again, more than 50% of you got it right. This is a willet. A few of you guessed yellow legs, and that's a little bit tricky because you can't see the legs very well in this one. But spotted sandpiper, also an understandable mistake to make because you do have the patterns on the breast here, but you've got more of a grayish color overall and a thicker bill. So with the willet, you've really got quite a thick bill, large bird, thick bill, stockier looking than a spotted sandpiper. All right, I have just a couple more for you. Okay, so what do we have here? Okay, and again, it looks like most people have answered. Fantastic participation, 82%. That's awesome, guys. Okay, so I am going to end the poll and share results. Okay, so this one was a little bit trickier. It was sort of almost evenly split between spruce grouse and rock ptarmigan. Some people guessed willow ptarmigan, but you're not seeing that chestnut neck. This is actually a spruce grouse. It is not a rock ptarmigan. And that's actually not a comparison that I made. But the thing that's really standing out to me, first of all, is this doesn't look like tundra. So that is my first point. And then you've got this black throat and chest there, which you can actually just see the edge of. So those are the two cues that I would use. But yeah, that is a tricky one. Okay. And after the tricky one, I think you'll find that this one is a little bit easier. What have we got here? Okay, people seem pretty sure of themselves on this one. Okay, so I'm going to stop it there. And just about everybody said that this is an American bittern, and you are indeed right. It is a bittern. So these guys, they have this sort of hunched gait, and they move very, very slowly. But the picture that I showed earlier, remember, was with him with his head back pointing at the sky, and that is their camouflage. All right, and one last question. This is our last mystery bird of the night. What have we got here? All right, looks like we're sort of, oh no, a few more coming in. All right, I will stop it there. So most of you said greater yellow legs. That is indeed correct. The yellow legs are the big Q here. You've got this long bill, which is more than 1.5 times the length of the head. So it's not a lesser yellow legs, it's a greater yellow legs. You've got the barring on the flank. You do have markings on the breast, but you don't have the spotted belly. So these aren't spots, first of all, they're sort of more like bars, and they don't go as far down as they do on the spotted sandpiper. Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed the quiz. If you enjoyed it, it's something that we will keep doing. But that is it for us tonight. And I just want to finish by pointing out, I know that a number of you have asked about the winter gull night that Nature NL runs. So the date for that has been set to Wednesday, February 23rd at 7:30. And you can find the link on their Facebook page. So if you're interested in learning more about gulls in winter, that would be your night. And I'll just finish off by saying thank you all for coming. And if there are questions, we will do our best to answer them, or you can feel free to email us later. And otherwise, have a great rest of Valentine's Day. If you're here on the Avalon, stay safe at home and don't go out in our blizzard. And hopefully we'll see lots of you next week.